I'll start getting messages from people going, hey, you're not online. Did it start, Ariel? Okay. All right, Luke chapter 12. Let's look at verses 16 through 21. He told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself. Now, do you notice that language? And do you hear the similarity between that and the people of Babel, for instance, who said, let us do for ourselves? He thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns, and I'll build large ones, and there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? And so we have this contrast set forth here, where this individual has built for himself and planned for himself and acquired great wealth and prosperity and food and shelter and all of those things that we spend our entire lives trying to amass for ourselves, right? And he sat back and said, okay, I'm taken care of now. I'm taken care of now for a long, long time. And what did God do to all that he had built? He essentially gave it to someone else. What the teaching of the Scriptures is once you die, you don't have control over the things that you own anymore. Somebody else gets them. That's what he did to Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar built this great kingdom with this great army and this great influence that controlled the world. But did it save Nebuchadnezzar? No. God was still able to take him down and to do what he willed with Nebuchadnezzar's great kingdom that he built for himself. That's what's taking place here. God says, you're a fool. You've made a terrible mistake, an assessment about what you think is important, about what you need to do. And what we see in this is it doesn't matter how great the thing that we build is. And it doesn't matter how wealthy we are, and it doesn't matter how prosperous we are. How many times have you heard people say, well, we live in the richest nation in the world, and so, or we've got the most powerful army in the world, so we can. The fact of the matter is, none of those things are important. What's important? God. God's will is important. Building the greatest nation in the world, what's going to happen to that nation? It's going to be destroyed. And it's not even a question, by the way. It's going to be destroyed. Doesn't matter how great it is. We've already talked about Babylon. Babylon was very wealthy, very powerful, had a great army. It's not here anymore. What about Assyria? They were pretty impressive too. Where are they at? Oh, they had been consumed by Babylon, hadn't they? So let's work down the other direction. The Medes and the Persians arose after Babylon. Where is that nation? Where's that kingdom? Oh, it was consumed by the Greeks, who had a great, great influence all around their part of the world, had a great army. They had great knowledge and understanding and wisdom. Where are they at? They were consumed by Rome. Where's Rome? It's history. What about Great Britain? That was a great nation. One of the most powerful nations in the world. one of the wealthiest nations in the world. At one time, it was said that the sun never set on the empire. They literally had holdings all around the world, so that there was always sunshine on some part of land that was under Great Britain's control. And a bunch of farmers from the east coast of North America laid waste to their Army and Navy. And guess what's going to happen to us one day? And all other nations and things that are made by God, that are made by man, and that are based in this world. They're all temporary. And that's what this is about. It didn't matter how much prosperity he had. It didn't matter how much wealth he had. It didn't matter how much wisdom he had. Look, he looked at the situation and realized, wait a minute, I've got so much coming in, I don't even have places to keep it, so I need to increase my storage so I can have even more. He does all that. He plans it. He has it built. He collects. And he doesn't get to use it. Which is the story that is repeated over and over and over throughout the Word of God. And it's trying to teach us something that no matter how great we are, no matter how wealthy we are, no matter how... When I'm building it, when it has something to do with me and my will and this earth and my time here, it's going to pass away. It's vain. And if I put my hope, my trust, my faith in those things, that I'm just as big a fool as this man. God said to him, fool. I'm just as big a fool as he is. Collectively, we're just as big a fool as he is if we do that. If we build a local church, no matter how prosperous it is, no matter how many people we have, no matter how much money we have, no matter how great the building, if we build it after our own desires, to accomplish our own purposes, according to our own will, guess what? It's worthless. It doesn't help us. It doesn't help anyone else. It doesn't glorify God. Listen, and when people do that, you know who they're really trying to glorify? Themselves. It's not about that. Work, however impressive, and don't misunderstand. Human work can be very impressive. We started this discussion a couple of weeks ago and talked about some of the amazing things that men have accomplished. Figuring out. If you go back and look in history, when smallpox was an epidemic level problem and was killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people, some guy, anybody know who it was? Salk. Looks around and says, wait a minute, these dairy maids that are milking these cows, they're not getting sick. Let me look into that, and lo and behold, they have a disease that they have caught from the cows that has lesions on their hands that look very similar to the smallpox lesions, but it's not smallpox, it's cowpox, and it's not at all lethal. However, because they've been exposed to cowpox, they don't catch smallpox. And he says, I wonder if this is transferable. And so he collects some of the pus, and he scratches people's arms, and he puts it in there, and he gets them sick with cowpox, and guess what happens? That group of people don't get smallpox, even though they've been exposed to it. And the process of inoculating people for disease is born. The idea that we can introduce things into our system that will create a reaction from our immune system to where we can resist these terrible diseases. That all happened from someone just watching the world around them and seeing it and going, hey, well, is this what this is? And figuring it out. In a decade, we put a man on the moon. We can do amazing things. But it doesn't really matter how amazing those things are. Turn to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, we're going to start reading in verse 21. And we want to read through verse 29. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Now, I want to say something. I believe that this kingdom is not of this world. I think that's what Jesus said about it. When they asked him, are you a king? He said, my kingdom is not of this realm. But I want you to understand, when it says the kingdom of heaven, that means the kingdom that belongs to heaven, the kingdom that is from heaven, if you will. Just like we understand that Church of Christ means it's the church that was built by Christ. This is the kingdom that came from heaven, not the kingdom from the earth. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And I will declare to them, your works were not mighty. You didn't do anything. Is that what he said? That's not what verse 23 says. I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. It's not a question of whether or not they did many mighty deeds. It's a question of whether or not they did what? The will of God. And they weren't. They weren't doing the will of God. They were pursuing their own will. And so he calls them workers of lawlessness, or workers of iniquity, depending on what translation you're reading. It's not a matter of our work not being great or not being impressive. It's not going to last because it is not from God. What's going to happen to everything that is connected to the earth? The earth and its works will be burned up. Its works. The earth's works. That is the pursuits of men that originate and rise up from ourselves. They're going to be destroyed. They're not going to last, and it doesn't matter how amazing that they are. And to bring this into focus and to talk a little bit more about just what we're capable of, and we're going to explain in a moment why we're capable of these things, but you got to recall back in Genesis 11, in the story of Babel, that God said when he looked down upon what they were doing, that if he doesn't go and do something about it, nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. Even God said that we can accomplish some amazing things unless he acts to prevent us. Nothing they purpose to do will be impossible. So let's go down there and confuse their language. Let's go down there and separate them. Let's go down there and put a stop to what they're doing, because they're going to succeed. We can do some just absolutely amazing things. It doesn't matter how amazing they are. It doesn't matter how great they are. It doesn't matter how glorious they are. The glory can reach to the heavens. It doesn't matter what happened in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. It was brought low. Why? Because he wasn't working with God. He was building. Yes, sir.
Mike, everything you're teaching on this always brings me back to the United States of America. How God has been with us through all the years, and
I mean, we're somewhere in the process. We're somewhere in the process. Now, I don't think this one is on my chart behind me because I think I added it this week. Turn to Genesis 4. We want to start reading. We can actually start reading at the beginning of the chapter. We're not going to. We're going to start reading in verse 10 or 8. Let's start reading in verse 8. That's the beginning of a paragraph. This is interesting. And I want you to keep in mind everything that we've talked about already. Keep in mind the people of Babel who were going to build their great city. Keep in mind God's discussion to Abraham where he says, I want you to leave where you're at. Leave this area, this great area that you're in Ur. And I want you to go to a place that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to build something for you. And then we went back last week and looked from Hebrews 11 that told us that Abraham was looking for a city whose had foundation and whose builder was God. That's what he was looking for. He was looking for God's city as opposed to any of the various kingdoms that man can raise up. That wasn't. He was a sojourner on the earth because he was looking for God's city. Because God said, I'm gonna make a nation. And so that's the contrast that's being put forth before us throughout the whole Scripture. Now, who's the first person ever mentioned by God about building a city on the earth? We're fixing to read about that. So let's start in Genesis 4:8. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. When they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you're cursed from the ground, which has opened his mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." And Cain said, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from the face, from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." And the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who found him should attack him. And we're going to stop right there for a moment. And I read all that just to set the stage of who we're talking about here. We're talking about that Cain. That Cain that killed Abel, his brother. That Cain that was cursed by God. That Cain that was driven away from the face of God. Listen to what it says in verse 16. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. So at this point, Cain leaves God. He went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of that city after the name of his son, Enoch. And we talked about that a little bit too. When we build things, what do we tend to do? Name them after what? Ourselves. Or someone that we care about. We do that. There are neighborhoods. All the streets are named after the family members of the developer. There are neighborhoods that wear the name of the developer. There are cities that are constructed that wear the name of the men who organized them and built them. We do that kind of thing. And that's exactly what Cain did. When Cain left God, when he went away from the presence of God, he found a place, he settled in a place, he built a city, he named it after his son. He was industrious, he was hardworking. He did some amazing things, but he did them without God. God wasn't involved in building that city. Cain was involved in building that city. And he's the first mentioned in the Scriptures. of men setting out to do that kind of work. And we tend to think that that is extremely, extremely important work. But it's vain. It's empty when it's done apart from God. It is earthy, which means it's temporal. It's going to be limited. At any level, whether we're talking about individuals, whether we're talking about households, whether we're talking about churches, about cities, about nations, at any level, humans are capable of building great things. We are capable of building prosperous things. We are capable of amassing wealth. We are capable of amassing influence and power. Why are we capable of doing all of those things? Why are we so good at doing that kind of stuff? You ever give any thought to that? How is it that we have figured out all the things that we figured out in medical science? How is it that we figured out all the things that we figured out in terms of flight? You realize, anybody remember when man took his first mechanical flight? Wilbur and Orville Wright. Anybody remember what year that was? I think it was 1901, I think. Pretty sure about that. Close to that. If I'm not correct. You realize in 1968, just 60 years later, we had a man walking on the moon. From the first mechanical flight till space flight, less than a century. Tell me we can't do some amazing things? Why are we able to look at the world around us and imagine and design and process and execute those plans and be successful at such a scale? Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." We can do great things because we are created in the image of God, and God is immeasurably great. And God has built into us and empowered us to be like Him. Able to think and process and plan. Able to solve problems. Able to dream dreams and then make those dreams become reality. Created in God's image. Genesis 11:6, this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. Without some kind of hindrance, without some kind of thing designed to work against us, human possibilities are limitless, according to God Himself. But when we build, whether we're talking about ourselves as individuals, whether we're talking about our households, whether we're talking about our churches, whether we're talking about our cities, our nations, or anything else, when we build ourselves without God and without following His will, we make ourselves enemies of God. And the moment we make ourselves an enemy of God, guess what is built in? The power and the force to prevent us from succeeding in the matter that we are planning to do. Nothing will be impossible for them, so let me go down there and do something. That's what God said in Genesis 11. I will go resist them. I will go put a stop to it. When we become enemies of God, He puts a stop to it. When I'm not building my life, myself, according to His will, I become God's enemy. I set myself as opposed to Him. What I'm doing is setting myself in His place. I'm exalting myself to His place. Is that not what Eve ultimately was doing? What was the temptation that put her over the top? God knows that in the day you eat of it, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And she wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. See, if I'm like God, knowing good and evil, then I don't need God, right? I don't have to rely upon Him. I don't have to rely upon His rules. The problem is that every way of man is right in his own eyes. So everything that I want to do seems like it's the right thing to do. But the way of man is the way of destruction. I set myself up, I make myself an enemy of God when I put myself in His place. And that is true no matter what we're building. If I don't build my home around God's design for the home and what He wants, if I don't make it God's home rather than mine, then I'm only asking for trouble. Ask David. When David walked not according to God's path, but did his own thing, it invited trouble to his house, did it not? And by the way, he fought that trouble for many, many, many years after it happened. Consequences for those things, they can hang around for a long time. We make ourselves an enemy of God. God said in verse 7 of Genesis 11, "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech." God said, I am going to separate them. Isn't that what your mama and daddy did with you and your siblings when y'all were causing trouble? You go over there, and you go over there, and y'all stay away from each other. That's essentially what God did. He sent everybody to their respective rooms. Now, that's not the only time He acted. You know when else He acted? He acted in the days of Noah. He looked down. His heart was broken over the condition of the things on the earth. He said, look, 120 years is as much as I can bear with this. In 120 years, this is all coming to naught. I have to do something. He acted. He acted with Babylon. He acted with Assyria. He acted with the Medes and the Persians. He acted with Rome. He acted with Jerusalem, His own people. The nation that He had built. Because they had ceased keeping His nation and started building their own, He brought it to naught as well. And over and over and over again, that is the story of God's work with men. Hebrews 10, verses 30 and 31, we know Him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And again, the Lord will judge His people. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. It should terrify us to make ourselves an enemy of God, but that's what we do when we start building instead of letting Him direct